Theirs is a little bit longer. Mine's a bit shorter, but you know what they say, it's not the length of your intake runners that matter, it's the length of your Most modern sport bikes use two stages of injectors. They have a lower injector that usually sits below the throttle plates, It's not the length of your intake runners that matter, it's the length of your Most modern sport bikes use two stages of injectors. They have a lower injector that usually sits below the throttle plates, relatively close to the intake valves. This is great for low RPMs because you get good atomization of the fuel and it gets sprayed pretty much right into the cylinder. But at higher RPMs, this fuel doesn't have enough time to RPM. But around 7,000 RPMs, you transition up to these injectors here. Your low RPM drivability and fuel efficiency comes from these, and your peak horsepower comes from these. I only care about peak horsepower, so I'm going to go with the upper injectors only. I got some Bosch injectors from DIY Auto Tune. I also got the Megasquirt MS3 Pro from them. This will be powering the injectors, but that comes later. I got injectors that are a little bit bigger than I need. With smaller injectors, they will be spraying fuel almost constantly, and that might cause an adjacent cylinder to pull fuel from the wrong injector. This could cause the inside cylinders to run a little more rich than the outside ones. BMW has their upper injectors inside these upper trumpets, so they shouldn't have to worry about this, but I don't have partitions between my injectors, so this might be a concern. With a little more fuel flow, I can have the injector open mostly only when the appropriate intake valve is open. This will negatively affect idle, but I don't care about that. The BMW intake has the upper injectors pretty far away. I can't do that because I have to fit this all inside a streamlined body. If I move the injectors up here, I'd have to have the body go around them, and that would increase the frontal area and would cause more drag. I might get a little more power from this, but not enough to make up for the added drag. So I moved the injectors down a little bit and angled them back a little bit. This is sort of splitting the difference between the upper and lower injectors. It's not ideal and it doesn't spray right at the valves, but I'm hoping at 13,000 RPMs there's enough chaos in here to fully atomize the fuel before it gets to the cylinders. So I have the intake runners and the fuel injectors. Now I need an air box. I'm going to pull air from the front of the vehicle, so I'll have this volume sweep forward. The idea is to eventually run this engine on 2 cylinders for the smaller 500cc engine class, but I'm going to go ahead and make an intake for all 4 cylinders. This way it's easier to run in the 1 liter class later. It's basically the same amount of effort to make a 4-cylinder intake as it is to make a 2-cylinder intake. So I have a triangle going forward with the throttle body on the front of it. This has a vague curve shape on the top to direct the air into the runners. I also have a shelf back here for the injectors to attach to. The top corners are angled like this to clear the body. I might have to do a slight bump here to clear the fuel rail, but I should be able to blend it in so that it doesn't affect aerodynamic drag. The intake is all faceted, so I can make this using my favorite manufacturing process, welded laser cut parts. If I were going to make this intake again, I'd probably raise the height up here to get more volume, and I'd probably also make it a little bit bigger on the back and sides, but I started fabricating the intake before I decided that, so it is what it is. Speaking of fabricating, originally I had considered just using the BMW throttle bodies, but there are a couple of problems with that. They have these lower injectors that I'm not using, and there's not really a great way to attach the intake to the top of it. I also want this intake to be able to take a turbocharger in case I want to do that at some point, and it's not going to be great with all these holes and passageways, so I made my own runners. I bought some aluminum tube and cut it to length. I duplicated the taper that BMW has in their throttle bodies. I assume it's there for a reason, so I just copied it. I chucked these up in a lathe and set the angle to 3.8 degrees or thereabouts and lathed in the taper. That's right, I lathed it. I lathed it on the lathe. I'm a lather. At the bottom, the runners attached to the engine with these rubber boots, so I duplicated the bottom of the stock throttle bodies. These turned out great, which is awesome because they were actually super easy to make. Win-win. There are also radiused inlets at the top of the runners. I'm going to call these trumpets. You can buy trumpets to weld in, but they're never exactly the right shape. I could 3D print these and install them inside the aluminum intake, and I did that on the S600. But I own a CNC router that can cut aluminum, so I just made my own. Typically, you'd have these higher in the manifold with air all around them, but I don't really have the space for this. It's also way easier to build it this way. I just bought some aluminum and CNC cut these trumpets in as part of the bottom plate of the intake. A really tight finishing pass with a ball end mill. Thankfully, I have my baby monitor camera that I can just periodically glance at to see when I broke an end mill. On the bottom, I cut out a little recess for each runner to nestle into so they are located accurately. I also CNC cut out the injector bungs. This is just a narrow piece of aluminum machined with little pockets for the bottom of the injectors. These 4 holes are the injector bung holes. These 3 holes are for some threaded rods I'm going to add in to clamp it all together. I'll have left-hand threads on the bottom and right-hand threads on the top, and an adapter in the middle to squish it all together. That way the injector will be squished between the fuel rail and the bung hole. The fuel rail is just some extruded aluminum fuel rail. You can get this in various sizes. I tapped these 3 holes here for those threaded rods. These 4 holes are drilled for fuel flow. I'll mill pockets in these holes for the other side of the fuel injector. We'll call this the rear bung hole. I started to machine this on my garbage hobby mill using an end mill with too many flutes chucked up since I don't have a collet this size, but after about 3 seconds I decided this was all around a bad idea, even for me. So I swung by a friend's shop and used his mill. Much better. You can also buy individual machined bungs that you can weld in yourself if you don't want to go the machining route. DIY Auto-Tune sells these for these injectors. I welded the runners to my trumpets, but I had some trouble doing this. At first I thought the plate was some odd alloy, but they're both 6061, so it should be weldable. This is not the worst aluminum welding I've ever done. Close. I got these most of the way done and decided to call it good. I'll smear some silicone sealant around the edge to make sure it's airtight. This is more than enough weld to hold these together, and I'm afraid if I keep going I'm going to blow through the sidewall on the runner since it gets pretty thin out there. If I get some gray 3-bond and smear it around the sides, nobody will ever notice. And if they do, that's fine too, because it will at least look better than this garbage. Once they were welded together, I filed down the edges between the machine part and the runners, then I went back and sanded it down with a couple different pieces of sandpaper. They were pretty close to begin with, but my angle on the lathe was off a tiny bit. I want these to be smooth so I don't have any disruptions in the airflow. The rest of the intake is laser cut and bent aluminum made by... Anyone? Send Cut Send. I went with an 1/8 inch or about 3 millimeters, which is pretty thick, but like I said, I do want to be able to turbocharge this in the future. I didn't add tabs to these laser cut parts like I usually do. I guess I was just being lazy with this project. This did unfortunately result in things not exactly lining up, so I had to do some bending and some squishing to get everything in line. The geometry on this is not critical, at least not for most parts, but the inlet near the throttle body should be somewhat accurate. I also had sharp corners that did not want to weld or get close to the corner, and a piece would just melt off and fall in. This was slightly frustrating, but about that time I ran out of both argon and aluminum filler, so I took a break to get some supplies. Before it was all together, I added the left-hand threaded bolts to the bung rail. I used red Loctite on this since I don't want it to come loose, but then I welded the rest of the intake, and the way you get Loctite off is to clean it up, so I'll just go back and re-Loctite this. The throttle body flange warped a little bit, so I'll need to figure out a way to flatten that out. I still need to add features to hold the throttle cables, and I should probably put some straps on the side to hold the intake down to the engine so a backfire doesn't blow this thing off of the engine. Anyway, that's an intake. We looked at the math, we ignored the math, we extrapolated from someone else's testing on a different engine, we looked at a bunch of online calculators, and we made a wild guess. And that, my friends, is engineering. Not actually engineering. It used to be that you had to impress people to get people to watch your show. Now you just have to impress the algorithm. So do me a favor, hit that subscribe button. All hail the algorithm.
shit.
おじい様のご様子はどうだ。
一心様は命を保っておられるのが不思議なほどです。
そうか。巫女よ、もう一度言う。不死のちぎりを俺と結べ。
できませぬ、源一郎殿。たとえひとたび敗れるとも、命を落とし主を必ず取り戻す。それが我が忍びなれば。
お迎えに参上いたしました。今しばらくお待ちくだされ。なるほどな。貴様を殺しきらぬ限り流飲を我が手にはできぬよ。参る。忍びよ、再び間に合う。
Whoops. I'm not in position for this. Okay.
お 見事だ、巫女の忍びよ。惜しいな。主を変えるつもりはないか。
ざれ言。
ざれ言だと。
There's more?
このアシナを守るためならば。
There's more?
異端の力であれ。従えてみせよ。
Oh. Shit.
巴の雷見せてやろう。
I don't remember the instructions for how to deflect. I don't remember. Ah! I don't remember how to do this. Ah! What do you do? Okay. Oh, is that what this is?
あなたが勝ったのですね。
お主。
争うつもりはありません。巫女の忍びよ。源一郎殿、もしや落ち水を。
More? There's more?
アシナはこの国は俺の全てだ。そのためなら俺は人間をやめよう。
死人帰りか。